Randy, the first music that I heard from you with Blood, Sweat and Tears, a couple of years ago.
Just a few.
But you only played 1 year with this band. How did you start to play music?
Well, my father was a musician and attorney, but he was a musician first. He was a wonderful pianist, and he had a good record collection and a great grand piano in the living room. So we heard music, both my brother, my sister, and my mother, who also played piano, and she was an artist, wonderful artist. We heard music every day.
Every day?
As soon as he got home from work, he'd either play piano or put on a bunch of records. So we started early. By the time, I was probably 6 years old, I already knew who everybody was, Miles Davis and Dizzy, and I could recognize who was playing. And I started to play trumpet at 8 years old and could already scat sing Lambert Hendrickson Ross, John Hendricks lyrics, Annie Ross, Twisted. So both my brother and I were very lucky to have that kind of childhood.
And you started both in professional business, did you, Michael and you?
We did. We both started when we were young. I was a teenager. I was maybe 15 when I became a professional musician in Philadelphia. Mike was a little later, not much later, but he started maybe when he was 17.
Do you remember the first gig that you played together?
Well, the first gig, I don't know if I can remember the first gig we played together. That's a good question, but I would imagine professionally it was with a gentleman who was a wonderful entertainer, singer, songwriter named Edwin Birdsong, who later became, I guess, well known having produced all the Roy Ayers records. And there was a band we started called Dreams in 1969 that also featured Billy Cobham on drums and John Abercrombie on guitar. And let's see who else you would know later, Will Lee and Don Grolnick. So that was probably the first band that we played in together. 1969, 1970, we recorded 2 albums for Columbia Records that are like, have a good underground following. Didn't sell much, but we were very popular in New York City at the time.
As the Brecker brothers then?
No, it was called Dreams, but that developed eventually 5 years later into being the Brecker Brothers Band.
Okay. And who was in the first band of the Brecker Brothers?
The first band was an outgrowth of this band, Dreams, and if you look up Dreams on the internet, or I think they still sell the records, they're really great. Barry Rogers on trombone, amazing trombonist, particularly the first one. But the original band, Brecker Brothers Band, grew out of that Dreams group. The original band was myself, my brother, and the great Dave Sanborn on alto sax. We had met in band camp when we were 15 years old. Then Don Grolnick on keyboards. We had also met when we were 15 years old at the Stan Kenton band camp. On bass, a gentleman named Will Lee, who is still in New York and probably most popular, having done the David Letterman show for 30 years, which was a nightly talk show, and is the busiest bass player in New York, still to this day. He came and joined Dreams when he was 17. We're still best friends, and we still play together. On guitar, there were 2 or 3 guitarists. One was Bob Mann, who is still around and playing, mostly with Steve Tyrell, a singer. But we met early on. He's on the first Brecker Brothers record, along with Steve Kahn, who is also still around. I still record with him to this day. He's the son of the great songwriter Sammy Kahn, who wrote many songs for Frank Sinatra and all the Hollywood guys. On drums, the first record was the great Harvey Mason, who also played with Herbie Hancock and currently plays with Foreplay and just everyone. He became the busiest studio musician in LA. And also a young gentleman named Chris Parker, who also became a very busy New York studio guy and played with the great band Stuff for many years along with Steve Gadd. And the first guitarist was John Abercrombie, who I hope you would know. He just passed away from his many great records. The original keyboard and bass player, and they were great too, but they weren't jazz musicians, so eventually they left to do their own thing, were Jeff Kent on keyboards and songwriting, and this is back in the Dreams days, and Doug Luban on bass. And when they left Dreams, we got Don, and it's a long answer, I know, and Will. That became the Brecker Brothers band eventually.
As one of the most important influences, you mentioned someday Clark Terry.
Right. Well, Clark Terry was a big influence on everyone and practically everyone's mentor. He was such a wonderful man, beside being a wonderful trumpet player. We met in 1965 at the Notre Dame Jazz Festival, where he was a judge, and I won a trumpet award that he gave me, a little plaque. And when I came to New York a year later, he asked me to join his big band in 1966. And I was friends through life with him. We miss him very much. He was kind of taken very ill and had many rough years, his last years in life, but he was just a complete gentleman and an influential trumpet player who's influenced every trumpet player that came after him, including Miles Davis, who said many times that Clark Terry was his mentor and idol.
And Clark Terry was one of the very, very few musicians who played in both bands, in the Bailey Band as well as in the Ellington Band, was he?
Well, he played, nobody played like Clark Terry, so everybody, when he was younger, wanted him to play in their band. And he had a very successful career in New York City. When I moved there in 1966, everyone wanted Clark Terry on their record. There were so many great records, Quincy Jones, you can just, huge list of big bands, and his own solo records, his group with Bob Brookmeyer. He was a wonderful man.
Sure he was. Another very interesting musician you played with, it passed away a couple of years ago, was Horace Silver. Mm-hmm. Do you remember how it was to play with him?
Well, sure. No one would forget their years with Horace Silver. He was the reason that I, in fact, left Blood, Sweat, and Tears in 1967, I think. Yeah. I played with Blood, Sweat, and Tears on their first record, Child is Father to the Man. And they were about, this is actually a funny story, they were about to do their second record. And Horace Silver had been calling me and asking me to join his band, which I really wanted to do. So we had a band meeting one night, and Al Cooper was the leader of the Blood, Sweat, and Tears group at that time. The other members kind of ganged up on him and said that he wasn't a strong enough lead singer, and they had heard this guy in Canada named David Clayton Thomas, and they wanted to add him to the band to be the lead singer. Al Cooper got up and quit. He said, "Oh, I'm going to leave the band." And I chose that time at this meeting to say, you know, guys, Horace Silver called, and I hate to say it, but I'm going to leave the band too. I want to play more jazz. And they begged me to stay and said they were going to cut everyone in equally to the next record, because we were sidemen, the horn section. We'll share everything, all the profits and all the publishing. I said, I don't think you guys are going to make it without Al. And I left, and I joined Horace Silver. And I got my friend Lou Soloff to take my place. He didn't want to do it. He said he didn't want to play in a rock band. I said, listen, you get $100 a week whether you work or not. It's a salary. It's $100 a week every week. And he said, well, maybe I'll do it. Okay, I'll try it for a while. So they went in the studio and recorded a tune called Spinning Wheel. Then they recorded a tune called You Make Me So Very Happy. Then they recorded a tune called And When I Die. Make a long story short, the second Blood, Sweat, and Tears record sold 11 million copies. And I was taking trumpet lessons with Lou Soloff. I had joined Horace Silver, and it was great, don't get me wrong. I was making $250 a week with Horace Silver. Lou Soloff's salary, when they hit it big and sold 11 million records, salary went up to $5,000 a week from $100. And little did I know, with Horace, he took taxes out, so I made $147.50 a week, and I had to pay my hotel out of that. So, but it was a wonderful experience playing with Billy Cobham. That's where we met Benny Maupin on saxophone and John B. Williams on bass and playing Horace Silver tunes. I got to play on every tune. Really, that helped me immensely in my development as a jazz musician.
And how did you come to play with Stevie Wonder?
Oh, well, that's a good question, and it was pure accident.
Accident.
Well, his regular trumpet player, is still around, Mr. Steve Medeo, was a good friend of mine, too. And Dave Sanborn, who I had met once again when we were 15, was in the band, Stevie's band. And whenever they came to New York, I would go see the band. They stayed at the Fifth Avenue Hotel and hang out. And Steve Medeo liked to drink. And he'd like to drink every drink in his minibar in the hotel room. And one concert, he did that, and he fell off the stage and fractured his skull. He's okay. So they needed a trumpet player, so they called me. That's how I got the gig, because he fell and fractured his skull. And I stayed with Stevie for close to a year. It was a big thrill. It took that long to Steve to heal, with Sanborn and with people like Ray Parker Jr., who eventually wrote Ghostbusters, and Ollie Brown on drums. And it was a thrill just watching Stevie perform every night and playing the horn parts and just watching a genius at work.
And you even played with Janis Joplin, as far as I remember.
Well, I played just a few gigs with
Yeah,
Janis
wasn't
Joplin.
much,
This is
but,
going way back into the probably 1966 or 67. Another good friend of mine, Luis Gasca, was her regular trumpet player, and I guess I had just left Blood, Sweat, and Tears, and he had some other commitments, so there were some gigs he couldn't do. So he called me to take his place, and she was riding high at that time. She had started a new band with horns, and they were more funky than rock and roll. She wanted to play kind of more soulful music, and she was great. It was a very sad loss when we lost her. She was only 27 years old. She was a wonderful performer, songwriter, singer, just incredible.
So you never made any difference between jazz music and popular music, rock music? It's just good music for you, is it?
Well, for me, it was all good music. Of course, in the jazz world, I got to play more, with Horace Silver Quintet. I got to improvise on every tune, so that's what I really liked doing. But I enjoyed, I grew up in Philadelphia, which was, every kind of music imaginable was popular there. I just grew up listening to different styles of music. Philadelphia brought out many jazz musicians like John Coltrane, who lived there, was just playing on Benny Golson, the Heath Brothers, Kenny Barron, Bill Barron, Stan Getz. If I made a list, it would be mind-boggling, all the great players. But it was also a home base for a lot of R&B artists and record labels that started in Philadelphia. A lot of the jazz guys figured out how to make their music more accessible for a larger audience. So there was a company called Gamble and Huff, Philadelphia International, all spearheaded by jazz musicians who signed local people, and many of the people, Leon Pendergrass, me and Mrs. Jones, what was his name, Billy Paul, they were all really bebop guys. Billy Paul was a bebop singer, could scat sing. Thanks for the name. So I grew up literally listening to both styles of music, and I love both styles, but I got to play, because I was a trumpet player, I wanted to play jazz. But also in the back of my mind, I always had a way to, hopefully I can appeal to a larger audience because I had had some experience seeing what was out there, you know what I mean? Playing with blood, sweat, and tears, seeing thousands of people that would come out, young kids, thousands would come out. And when I would go back to New York and play with Clark Terry's band or Duke Pearson's big band or even the Thad and Mel Jazz Orchestra, there'd be maybe 50 people or 20 people in the audience, and sometimes we'd make $20. Thad and Mel's band paid $20. Some of the other bands paid $5. So I had an idea in my head to really write music that featured jazz and pop and R&B and meld them into one thing, and utilize all my life's experiences to create my own music, which a lot of which we played earlier today, and that's what developed into the Brecker Brothers Band. Someone else named the band, actually. It wasn't our idea to call it the Brecker Brothers, even.
No? Who did it?
Well, I'll tell you this story too. I had written all the music. I was a little ahead of my brother in that respect. He was just practicing the saxophone. And I had this idea to bring Dave Sanborn, once again, who I had met when I was 15, when they both moved to New York City around the same time. And I had met these other guys through dreams, so I started to write my own music, some of which we played today earlier, some skunk funk, sponge. I had 9 arrangements for these specific musicians that I mentioned earlier, and the intent was to do a Randy Brecker solo record. That was the whole idea. It was like a hobby, musical hobby, because we were all very busy in the recording studios making a living and also playing at night. But then I got a call from a gentleman named Steve Brecker, who had signed a production deal with Clive Davis, who was very famous in the music business, having been president of Columbia Records. He had signed our group Dreams to Columbia Records. And Steve said, you know, I have a new production deal. Clive Davis has a new label that's going to be called Arista Records. And he's heard about the music you've written, because we were rehearsing every week and kind of word filtered around about the band. And Steve said, if you call this band the Brecker Brothers, Clive will sign you right away. You won't have to do a demo, and that's what you used to have to do back then, to record your music and then try to take it around and sell it to various record companies. He said, if you call this band the Brecker Brothers, you won't have to do any of that. We'll sign you right away. And at first I said, wait a minute. Is this supposed to be Randy Brecker record? And plus there's 3 horns, so it'll look funny. Dave Sanborn is in the front line, and he's not a Brecker brother, so he'll be a long-lost cousin. It's going to look funny. But it was such a nice opportunity. Clive Davis, you can't go wrong. He was the most powerful man in the record industry at that time. So about a week later, I called up. We'll say, okay, call it the Brecker Brothers. And the band was born. He named it, Clive Davis. And that's not the end of the story, actually. I'll tell you one further. So we went in and recorded all these 9 tunes, once again, some of which we played earlier today, some skunk funk. We played Levitate, and they were all great. We really knew what we were doing because we had been rehearsing. And we done a lot of records for other people. We knew the mechanics of making a jazz rock record, how to build from the bottom up and record the horns and double track studio techniques. Anyway, I got a call from Clive Davis, and he said, I want to meet you at my office. And I went over to Arista Records. I was kind of the band leader. Mike, like I said, hadn't written. They were all just practicing and having a good time, but I was kind of career-minded. Clive said, you know, I love the 9 tunes you wrote, but that was a big but, too. When I heard but, I said, uh-oh, here we go. He said, but you guys need a single. And I said, wait a minute. First of all, this was supposed to be a solo record, Randy Brecker, and now you call it the Brecker Brothers. And now I wanted it to be my own tunes, not anyone else's. And he basically said, if we don't do a single, he's not going to put the record out. Clive had a way of negotiating, and that was it. It's kind of like Donald Trump in a way. It was his way or no way. So I went back to our little rehearsal studio and I said, guys, we got to jam up a tune. We need a single or he's not going to put the whole thing out. And I guess the force was with us. I still have this cassette. It took us about 4 hours. Everybody had a little idea. And we jammed up a tune named Sneaking Up Behind You. Will Lee thought of the lyrics. It was kind of like a disco average white band. We had a little melody, then Will thought of a bridge, and it was called Sneaking Up Behind You. Little words, and we went in the studio and gave it to Kleiß, and he loved it. We were lucky. He loved the tune. Little ideas, we changed a couple little things, but to make a long story short, that single is what made the Brecker Brothers band and became #2 on the R&B urban charts. And then the record shot up the pop charts. This was, for me, going just to be a hobby, because we were busy doing studio work. The next thing you know, because of that single, the record had sold 200,000 copies, which for jazz guys was really a lot. And next thing you know, we're on Kleiß now, he's trying to get us out of town and do festivals and tour, which we did somewhat, but we were so busy in the recording studios, we didn't want to make a full commitment. But those two things, the fact that Kleiß wanted a single, which we did, and the Brecker Brothers name kind of caught on. It just kind of rolls off the tongue, BBB, Brecker Brothers Band. And that's what kind of made the band. And plus was lucky enough to have been writing all this stuff, so all the pieces fell together.
Yes, indeed. The two things that you mentioned are important to have success. A label for a band like Brecker Brothers and a single to be played in the radio stations.
Yeah, exactly.
Because if you don't have a single, they won't play you.
Yeah. So Kleiß, in the end, knew what he was doing. So, I was lucky that I paid attention to him. But at the same time, it was great that we were playing our own music. Eventually, everyone in the band started to write music. My brother did, and we really became, we were best friends, and it was a very nice experience. So everybody started to contribute, and we called it, instead of Brecker Brothers, this was okay with Kleiß, we called it Brecker Brothers Band. And we did 6 records for Kleiß Davis, all of which sold really well, and that's really basically why I'm still here.
Yeah. In these days, the Brecker Brothers was more or less your band, your own band. You can compose, you can lead it, you can make the gigs or not. But how was it to play with, for example, with a band leader like Art Blakey? Because he was very, very...
Oh, yeah. Well, that was also around that same time. Leading up to the band Dreams, Art Blakey needed a trumpet player. Horace Silver had broken up the band pretty suddenly in 1968, I think it was. He wanted to move to California, and he was very business-oriented. He gave us 2 weeks' notice. We had a meeting in California, and he said, guys, I'm breaking up the band. I'm going to move to California. I think he had recently gotten married and then divorced. So Billy and I, we all trudged back to New York with no gigs 2 weeks later. And Art Blakey was looking for a trumpet player. I knew Woody Shaw pretty well, so he recommended me. And I stayed with Art Blakey for about 9 months, on and off. He wasn't working that much, but we played a lot at a club called Slugs in New York, and we toured up and down the East Coast. And of course it was a thrill playing with him, getting to know him. Carlos Garnett was a wonderful Panamanian saxophonist, but it wasn't a good period in Art Blakey's life. He didn't really have a record deal, so we never recorded. And at one time, you've heard all stories about Art Blakey. His personal life maybe was a little controversial, shall we say. He was like an African chief. He had about 13 wives, 14 kids, and sometimes he wouldn't come up with the money. So eventually it just got a little too much, and I basically left the band. But it was a thrill while I was there.
Sure, I guess. And there was one gig with Eric Clapton in the Royal Albert Hall in London. Was it in '89?
I forget what year. It all gets pretty foggy after the first few years, so you're lucky. But yeah, it was around '89, I guess. We played a week with Eric Clapton, who I had known actually since the Blood, Sweat, and Tears days, and run into him several times in London, and played on a couple of his records, and he wanted to add a horn section, so we played for a week at Royal Albert Hall with a New York horn section featuring mostly guys from the Saturday Night Live TV show, Alan Rubin, myself, Tom Bones Malone, Lou Marini, and Ronnie Cuber on baritone. A lot of fun playing that. But once again, then it's back in rock and roll, and it's exciting playing for thousands of people every night, but you don't get to really play much. It was fun playing the arrangements. They were all very good. Great drummer, good friend Steve Ferrone on drums. It was a great band. So when you have gigs like that, you know, you take it for what it is, and there's a lot of positives about it, but you don't really get to play solos very much. It's more a horn section.
Did you play any solo in Singapore? Because he was, right before he came to this place, he was playing in Singapore together with Ulf Akenius.
Yeah. Oh, there was a big band, but yes, I did get to play I was a featured artist almost like today, although I was sitting in the trumpet section, but I was a featured mentor. So this was an educational project where some of the people in the big band were students and learning from the older fellows in the band. So it was a very rewarding experience. Ulf Akenius was in the band, Lewis Nash, some guys from New York and America, along with Singaporeans and some Chinese, people from all over the world, really. So we spent a little over a week there teaching and playing, so it was a lot of fun.
And how did you come to play with the Latvian big band, which we heard today here in Timmendorfer Strand?
Well, you know, it was a situation kind of like this where I was just called. I don't remember where we played. I think it was in Riga in Latvia at a festival. And this was probably about 5 years ago. Had very little rehearsal, but that time we did have a rehearsal. And I marveled at the fact that they learned all the music. A lot of it is very hard. And we had a rehearsal, but there was not one mistake. I didn't have to go over anything. I said to the guys, you know, we don't even need a rehearsal. You're playing everything perfectly. And we played the gig, and it was a lot of fun. And then they called along with the great Niels Landgren and asked if I would play with them again here. And I remembered the other gig. I said, sure, this is a great band. And today, for instance, we had no rehearsal and no sound check, like I mentioned to the audience. We just straight went out. We made sure the mics were on. I had a list of tunes and the solos, and we just played. No rehearsal, no talking, once again, they played everything perfectly.